We are going to move right into the next presentation. We have today for our 10 a.m. session, Valentina Beeghini, who will be presenting on ILO C190, Violence and Harassment in the World of Work. Ms. Valentina Beeghini is a lawyer by training with a PhD on European and comparative legal studies and over 10 years working experience at the national and international level, including with governmental agencies, UN, NGOs, and private sector in Europe, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. She has worked extensively on fundamental principles and rights at work, international labor standards, gender equality, and children's rights. She is currently working as legal spec, violence, harassment, and non-discrimination in the International Labor Organization, or ILO, in Geneva, coordinating the work on promoting of the ratification and implementation of the ILO Violence and Harassment Convention, which is ILO C190, which she's discussing here today, which was created in 2019. It's number 190, and its accompanying recommendation. So just a reminder to everyone that I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. If you have questions, feel free to send them throughout the session, but we'll probably be saving questions until the end. Thank you so much, Ms. Beeghini.
Thank you, Amber. Good morning, everyone in Canada and everywhere you are. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you for the really touching, wonderful words shared by Jenny, by Jimmy. So it has been a real pleasure to hear from her, and yeah, it's quite a little bit of a jump now to look into international law. So I apologize for this abrupt change of tone. But yeah, what has been shared earlier is very much in line with these new international standards, and I think it's a great way to set the scene. So without further ado, I will share my screen. If any technical problem, just let me know, Amber or anyone, and I will stop. Okay, so this is the presentation for today. Okay, is that okay?
Yes, I can see your slideshow. Yes,
perfect.
Thank
you. Okay, great. So as Amber was mentioning, I'm here to give an overview to this latest international convention on violence and harassment in the world of work that was adopted in 2019 by a large majority of tripartite delegation of International Labour Organization. For any of, I'm sure that all of you knows the ILO, just for, I mean, if anyone does not know who we are, the International Labour Organization is is an agency of the United Nations dealing in particular with labor law, labor matters. We, Common Organization, has been established more than 1 century ago, so in 1919, and the mandate is to promote social justice and decent work. The organization has a unique constituency, which is created by a tripartite delegation of 187 countries. And this is really a unique feature compared to other UN agency. And what we mean for tripartite is that we have representatives from governments, of course, but also employers and workers organizations. So every official documents, including convention, including recommendation, which are part of international law, have been discussed and agreed upon tripartite delegation. So the voices of not only governments, but also workers and employers have been heard and taken into account. So today I'm here to present this new convention. I mean, you are, I think, given the focus of this wonderful week, and by the way, congratulations for 11 years. It's really a long time. Congratulations for being at the frontiers of this important topic. Given your background, I know that everyone is well acquainted with the topic that I'm talking about, so violence and harassment. Needless to say, that is a widespread phenomenon in all countries, and so there's no country or sector that is free from violence and harassment. And as was also mentioned from Julie, there is and from Nicole as well, there is a range of factors that lead to violence and harassment, and discrimination, cultural bias are among them, but also stress, poor working conditions, working in contact with the public, students, parents, patients, working alone, working in remote areas, informality. So violence and harassment is a phenomenon that has different causes. Of course, crisis exacerbate the vulnerability to violence and harassment, and the latest, pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has just shown how crisis can lead to an increase in violence and harassment. If we think about all essential workers, workers in the care economy during the pandemic, from hospitality, education, we have an increased rate of violence and harassment, but without even mentioning domestic violence. Therefore, I think all of us, or many of us, home became our place of work, and this also led to an increased ramping rates of violence and harassment, which has an effect on the world of work, on workers, on employers, and on respectful working environment. But as the title and the topic of this week clearly spells out, violence and harassment is key because not only is a violation of human rights, but undermine mental and physical health. And this is here I wanted to just highlight what Nicole was mentioning before. For many years, when we were talking about violence and harassment, we were talking about gun shooting or physical violence. But we were indeed less familiar or less ready to talk, or less aware of the many subtle forms that violence and harassment can assume, can manifest itself, and with the consequent damages and harm on mental health of workers, but I have to say beyond workers, because bystanders, colleagues, family members, communities, everybody is touched by these episodes of violence and harassment and the harm that causes to people.
Hi, Valentina.
Yeah.
I'm
Yes.
so sorry to interrupt.
No, don't worry.
I've gotten a couple of messages that people are having a hard time hearing your audio.
Okay,
Can your mic be adjusted somehow, perhaps?
Should be okay. Can you hear me better now?
That's a little better. It's a little muffled, but that's louder.
Okay, what I can do, Can you hear me better now?
That is louder. If I could get a chime in from the folks doing interpretation, is that better for you folks?
Is it better? Is it better?
That's better for me. I'm hoping to hear a chime in from the folks doing interpretation, even just in the chat to confirm, but it sounds louder and a little clearer for me.
Okay.
Yes, that's better. Thank you so much.
Okay,
yes.
Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, so where we are. Yeah. So okay, just 1 second. Apologies for this. Okay, so I know that the next presentation will present some data on the incidence of violence and harassment, but here I just wanted to touch base briefly on some data that the ILO collected I mean, 2 years ago. We published the report at the end of 2022 on the prevalence of violence and harassment, because I mean, we've talked for years about violence and harassment, but of course it's very difficult to grasp the magnitude of this phenomenon. So we partner with Gallup and Lloyd Register Foundation, which I'm sure you know, because they work very heavily on occupational safety and health. And we carry out this first exploratory exercise on violence and harassment at work. So we interview people in 120 countries, submit the same questionnaire on the incidence of physical, psychological, and sexual violence and harassment. And the data that we found out, which actually need to be considered a little bit underestimation for several reasons that I don't have the time here to explain. But regardless of that, the data are quite alarming, because our data shows that 1 in 5 persons in employment have experienced violence and harassment at work, either physical, psychological, or sexual over the working life. If we look at the different forms of violence and harassment, psychological violence and harassment is the most prevalent, with 1 in 5. We have physical violence and harassment with 1 in 10, and sexual violence and harassment with 1 in 15. And many people, I have to say, I mean, also sexual violence and harassment has been one of the topics that has been difficult to discuss during interview, because there is still a lot of the stigma and bias and difficulties in sharing such experiences. We also noticed some gender feature, because women were particularly exposed to sexual violence and harassment, while men to physical violence and harassment. But going back to what Ginny and one of the previous questions raised, the issue of intersectionality emerged from this survey. So for example, young women were more than 2 times more exposed to sexual violence and harassment compared to young men. Or migrant women workers were 2 times more exposed to sexual violence and harassment compared to non-migrant women workers. So here this proves really the effects of the intersection of different grounds of discrimination and different identities at the workplace. What also the survey found out is that violence and harassment is not an isolated episode, but it happens several times during the working life of a person. And more than 3 in 5 victims of violence and harassment say it happened several times, multiple times. So here it questions, you know, how can we do better to prevent the repetition of such occurrences? Some groups are more at risk, including youth, migrant, and wage and salaried workers. Another key results of this survey was that only half of the victims were comfortable or spoke to anybody about violence and harassment. And among the 3 top reasons for not talking about violence and harassment at work was still bias, social concern. So the fact to be judged by co-workers and communities, lack of clarity. I mean, interesting lack of clarity in internal procedure. So they didn't know how to do, what to do to put forward a report. And the other interesting data that we found out is that there's a connection between violence and harassment happening at work and discrimination happening throughout the life of a person. either in, in housing, I mean, outside the workplace. We found out that people who have faced discrimination in their life, okay, were more exposed to violence and harassment at the workplace. And we disaggregated this data according to some grounds. So sex or gender was among the highest grounds of discrimination. So who the people, the respondents who experienced discrimination based on sex or gender in their life were more than double, than 2 times more at risk of violence and harassment at work. Alarming data was also found for people who faced racist discrimination in their life. So although, as I said, this data needs to be taken, in the context, and we need to also to understand the limitation of the survey, but they provide a very useful background and picture to question ourselves, how to do better, how to prevent these things from happening, how to stop them, and also how to put in place a sort of whole of government approach, because the world of work is not something separate from the rest of, for other people, spheres of life. For all this reason, the ILO started talking about violence and harassment. So here it's a very short, summary of the standard setting process that led to this convention. I will not go into details, but this is just to highlight that a convention has been in the making, for years. Actually, the first attempt to have an international standards, a treaty on violence and harassment was put forward already in 29. But then, I mean, public administration, and if you think about international public administration, at times they're even more complicated. So we managed to put it on the agenda of our governing body, which is our executive branch, and of the conference, which is our, let's say, our parliament, in 2015. What is important is that every step has been consulted. And in the case of Canada, which is a federal state, ILO constitution requires the federal governments to consult with provinces and all other levels of government. So you see here, white report, questionnaire, responses to questionnaire, office commentary, draft of conclusion. All these different steps have been gone through a tripartite discussion with 187 countries, a different level of governments, depending on the national structure and national circumstances. And the convention was finally adopted in 2019, and I'm glad and delighted to say that Canada played a key role, because you see in the picture, I don't know if you know any, if you recognize any of your compatriots. The second from the left is Mr. Rakesh Patri. He was the chairperson of the committee. He's worked for the government of Canada. And the fourth from my left, Miss Marie-Claire Walker, from the Canadian trade unions. So congrats to Canada, because really it was a great push and help towards the throughout the process. It's important here to say is that we had Convention 190, which is a treaty and is binding when a member state ratify, and then we have Recommendation 206, which is not a binding document, a binding treaty, but it provides guidance in applying the convention. Going back to what Jimmy was saying, this convention, yes, it's the first ever framework on violence and harassment in the world of work. There are other norms in other treaties, also including in ILO convention, but let's say that this convention provides the first framework to tackling the phenomenon. And the goal, the underneath goal that was repeated several times by many countries from different constituency is that this convention aims to build a future of work, a world of work based on dignity and respect for all. And so I like to go back to what Ginny was saying about people complement each other, having their own gift. So this convention really aims to make sure that the system respect everyone's dignity, everyone's diversity, and respect all this diversity and recognize the gift that all of them can put forward, can complement to the world of work and create a respectful world of work for everyone. This is the list of countries that are ratified. Canada ratified in January last year, and it will enter into force next year. We can talk later about this. What I wanted to say here is that despite COVID, because you need to remember that it was adopted in 2019, early March, early 2020, basically the world got in a lockdown for, I mean, in some countries for 2 years. But despite that, we managed to get 32 ratification, and many are in the pipeline. So we are expecting other countries to ratify. This is really important because it really testifies the importance of this treaty, the importance of the topic, and the importance to put an end to violence and harassment. This also goes hand in hand with the recognition in 2022 as a safe and healthy working environment as fundamental principle and right at work. And we will go back on this later.
Because like even to buy them, like as far as I can tell online, they're like 15 and then you have shipping and stuff. So 30 here sounds perfect.
Nicole.
Sorry, I can hear some noise. Yeah, thanks. So
yeah, well, I mean, I'm always happy.
Apologies.
Oh yeah, I never mind. Like I don't mind looking stuff up for you, but if you get
can we have Zoom support actually mute Nicole? I think that might be possible on our end.
Thanks, Amber.
Okay.
So this is really important because violence and harassment is part of every.
Yeah, because like what if they even have them? That'd be wild.
Apologies, Amber. It's very difficult to talk because it's quite high.
Yes, I agree. Is our Zoom support able to mute hosts and panelists? Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Thanks. So as I said, COVID and the high, violence and harassment, high rates that we experience, but also the recognition of health and safe working environment has fundamental principle and rights at work, for sure pushed for this high number of ratification in such a short time span. So let's go now in, I think, 15 minutes that I have left on the key principle of the convention. So the first innovative element is that Convention 190 recognize the rights of everyone to a world of work free from violence and harassment, including gender-based violence, and calls member states who ratify this treaty to respect, promote, and realize this right in practice. This right, I mean, is the first time that this right is clearly spelled out in such a way, in such a clear way. We could have, imply this from the right to equality and non-discrimination, from the right, duty of care, or the right to be safe at work. But before 2019, there was no international treaty, no international law that clearly spelled out this right to a world of work free from violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment. And let's look at what violence and harassment means for the convention. For the convention, violence and harassment is an umbrella term that includes a broad range of behavior, unacceptable behavior or practice or threat, no matter if single occurrence or repeated, that have the cause or have the potential to cause
harm, okay? The harm can be either physical, psychological, sexual, or economic. And this notion of violence and harassment include gender-based violence and harassment. What I want to highlight here is that the notion, the focus of this definition is on harm. We go back to mental health and physical health, is on harm, is on the victim, is a victim-centered approach. So there's no mention of the intent to cause any harm. There's no mentioning of the perpetrator. This can be supervisor, a co-workers, a peers, a client, someone external. There's no mention of the perpetrator, okay? What is important is the harm caused to the victim. And gender-based violence and harassment, we have the first definition for the ILO, which is defined as violence and harassment directed at a person because of their sex or gender. The convention has a strong focus on gender-based violence because it recognizes that women and girls in all their diversity, including indigenous women and girls, or women and girls from racial or ethnic minorities, are more at risk of violence and harassment. And this notion of gender-based violence and harassment includes sexual harassment. Of course, this is the definition of international at international level. The convention is a flexible instrument because a convention needs to last, need to win the test of time. That's why definition in national laws or regulation could, of course, provide for this single concept, but could also use or continue to use a separate concept, because we know that in many national jurisdictions, we might have different definition. We can talk about verbal abuse, mobbing, bullying, menace. So we have different definition. What is important for this convention is that really this broad range of unacceptable behavior that cause harm are prohibited and eliminated. The notion, what is important also is the notion of unacceptability, because there was a lot of discussion during the standard setting. So during those 5 years that I show you, what does unacceptable behavior mean? And here we go back to both a cultural and societal perspective and an individual. So this is something that every national governments, national actors need to highlight. But the notion of unacceptability relates to both individual, okay, so we can think about grounds of discrimination, personal characteristics, and also societal unacceptability. So right of violence and harassment, to whom, who has this right? And this convention is very broad because it applies to all sectors, private and public, formal and informal. I can see from the program that we have presentation from the military, if I'm not mistaken. Every sector is covered, either public, private, formal, informal economy. Because as Ginny would say, here the goal is to create and to enhance respect and dignity for all in every place where work is carried out. And for this reason, this convention does not only protect employees, okay, but protect everyone is in the workplace, is in the world of work, and carry out work regardless of their contractual status. It also protects interns, persons in training, job seekers, and you see, if you think at the discrimination of violence, including sexual harassment, racial harassment that job seekers and job applicants could face, these are covered. It covers also employers as a physical person, because again, when we think about this convention, it's to go back to the ultimate goal, to create dignity and respect for all. And employers as physical person are part of it, and they can also be victim of violence and harassment. The convention also considers third parties for obvious reason, not only because third parties can be perpetrators of violence and harassment. Think about education sector, hospitality, persons sectors working in contact with the public, but also because third parties can be victim. And again, think at, I mean, the example that Ginny was mentioning about the damage to students for cultural insensitivity. What was really clear during the convention, and here we had, I had to say, the African group was very vocal on this. What this convention aimed to be is that everyone entering an office, a post office, a bank, a supermarket, everyone can feel this respectful environment. What Ginny would say, I mean, the harmony with the universe, I mean, in other way, but it's really the respectful environment for everyone. And so right of everyone to a world of work, free from violence and harassment. What is the world of work? This convention has a broad scope of protection, and the world of work is not only the workplace as traditionally meant. I mean, during COVID, we experienced that our private houses can be world of work. We know that sidewalks can be world of work. So the convention says that people need to be protected basically wherever they are because of their work. And this could be also work-related trips, training, also this one for the workers engaged here, social activities, work-related communication, including, you know, WhatsApp group, Teams, every social media that we're also using for our work, and commuting to and from work. The second innovative element is that this convention is grounded in a right-based framework. So we recognize that if we wanted to eliminate violence and harassment, and eventually to protect the physical and mental health of everyone, we need to continue pushing for the respect of other human rights, and particularly of fundamental principles and rights at work. The ILO has 5 fundamental principles and rights at work, which are also human rights, which is freedom of elimination of child labor, elimination of forced labor, freedom of association, right to organize and collective bargaining, equality and non-discrimination, and safe and healthy working environment. So if we want to eliminate violence and harassment, we need to continue promote and realize this fundamental principle right at work, and also decent work. For obvious reasons, forced labor is violence, child labor is violence. There is research that say that unionized workplace have less violent incidents of violence and harassment, for instance. Equality and non-discrimination and OSH and safety and health, the working environment, I mean, by definition, they are important for violence and harassment, because violence and harassment are strongly, I mean, is overlapping, is within them. And decent work. Why decent work? Because there is research that say that poor working condition is one of the catalysts, one of the root causes for the higher incidence of violence and harassment. So all this interplay of rights need to be, you know, need to be promoted because they play an essential role in eliminating violence and harassment. A specific focus is going back to Ginny, to member states' obligation to promote the right to equality and non-discrimination for groups in vulnerable situations. The convention does not list any groups. This is left to governments' responsibilities, depending on national circumstances, but needs to be in line with international law. And international law, we have treaties protecting indigenous people. We have treaties protecting people from racial and ethnic minorities, migrants, women, of course, youth, people with disabilities, HIV, AIDS. So those groups who are at risk of higher rates of discrimination because they don't enjoy the full rights to equality and non-discrimination need to be prioritized. And within this rights-based framework, the innovative element is, as I said before, that it brings together equality, non-discrimination, and OSH. Violence and harassment in the past has been dealt either as a equality non-discrimination issue, racial harassment, sexual harassment, or as a safety and health issues, gun shooting in supermarkets, in bank, physical violence. For the first time, they are together. So, and we will see in a few minutes, occupational safety and health measures, mechanism need also to prevent hazards or risk arising from discrimination, arising from harmful social, cultural, and gender social norm. Okay, this is so innovative. I mean, it was never said before in an international treaty. Many countries are moving towards amending their legislation to make sure that, for example, risk assessment also include the risk, also include discrimination, also include a higher risk of discrimination as a hazard to violence and harassment. The other core principle is that when a member state ratify the convention, it needs to adopt an inclusive, integrated, and gender-responsive approach in consultation with workers and employers representatives for the elimination of violence and harassment. Inclusive, because there is a big scope of protection. Integrated, because, I mean, I think you understand now that this protection is not only the scope of labor law or occupational safety and health. There are different branches of legislation that needs to play a role. So we have criminal law, we have migration, of course, OSH, equality, non-discrimination, collective agreements, both at sectoral level, national level, and it's a whole of government approach that needs to be put in place. This approach needs to be, of course, to provide accessibility. Okay, there is a strong focus on accessibility and need to be gender responsive. Why gender responsive? Because we cannot tackle the symptoms of a phenomenon, I mean, the bad symptoms, if we not tackle the root causes. So the fact of being gender responsive is really to take into account the underpinning elements of violence and harassment. Of course, this approach does not require a one-fits-all solution. This is clear. And the convention calls for specific measure tailored to the needs of each sector's occupation, work arrangement, because people working in agriculture may be exposed to risk of violence and harassment different from people working in the education sector. People working remotely can face a different risk or hazard compared to people working in a office in downtown capital city. So yeah. This approach has three pillars, and I will be very brief, so to leave space for some questions. One is prevention and protection, enforcement and remedies, and training and awareness. I really appreciate what Nicole was saying at the beginning of the seminar about the role of mediation, how we, dispute resolution mechanism, how we investigate, and the role that these processes have in eliminating violence and harassment. The convention recognizes this, but also says that if we want to really be successful and sustainable, we need to have measures, need to go hand in hand on all these aspects, prevention and protection. So we need to prevent violence and harassment, including discrimination based violence and harassment can be prevented. We need enforcement of remedies, and we need training, awareness, guidance. We need a societal change, because eventually it's mindsets need to change. And the workplace, the world of work can be an excellent entry point to push changes in societies. So briefly, here are the obligation for governments when they ratify. For prevention and protection, I will just highlight 2 points, because I know that there are some HRD officers or employers. So the convention asks member states to put in place laws and regulations requiring employers to adopt workplace policies on violence and harassment, okay, to eliminate violence and harassment, to take into account violence and harassment and its associated psychosocial risk into OSH and risk assessment. Provide training and information to workers. And of course, it calls for workers' collaboration. Ending violence and harassment is not a government's responsibility, is not an employer's responsibility only at the workplace, is everyone's responsibility. Okay, workers, employers, their organization, governments, third parties, clients, everyone has a role to play. And if we look at the element of this workplace policy, the recommendation provides some guidance. What are the elements? What are the concrete elements for a workplace to put forward measures to eliminate violence and harassment? First of all, statement that violence and harassment will not be tolerated. Establish prevention programs, and I really liked what Jenny was saying about cultural sensitivity training. This could be part and parcel of prevention programs to overcome bias, to overcome discrimination, which are the root causes of many forms of violence and harassment. Clearly specify the rights and responsibilities of workers and employer, contain information of complaint, investigation procedure. And another article, paragraph of the recommendation, highlight features for complaint and investigation procedure in case of gender-based violence and harassment, but we could extend them to any form of discrimination-based violence and harassment. So to have gender responsive training for the people doing this complaint investigation procedure, to be timely. So there are some key recommendations that you could look at. Provide that all internal and external communication related to incidents will be duly considered, of course, the respect of confidentiality and privacy, and measures to protect complainants, victim, against victimization or retaliation. We do know that when people dare to speak up, that they are victim of violence and harassment, many of the time they're also victim of retaliation or victimization from managers, co-workers as well, peers. So protection against retaliation and victimization needs to be strengthened. And when I talk about OSH, because here, I mean, you are very expert on safety and health measures. For the first time, recommendation 206 spell out that OSH system, OSH management system, need to take into account hazards and risk that arise from discrimination. So going back to what Ginny was saying about bias and more cultural norms towards indigenous people, for instance, or people belonging to racial and ethnic minorities, we need to do something. I mean, these considerations need to be included in OSH management system. And being you expert, you know how powerful this can be, because OSH measures are regularly updated, checked, supervised, and controlled. So this is really can be a game changer also for discrimination. The second pillar is enforcement of remedies. I just would like to highlight that here the convention recognizes the right to remove themselves from a situation of danger. It also talks about labor inspectors and other authorities, and the need to ensure access to remedies and support for victims. And guidance and training goes back to what I was saying before. So we need training for both employers and workers, but we also need training for the public which has a contact with the workplace. We need training for, I mean, the recommendation talk about gender responsive education curricula, because we need to train, to make aware the next generation of workers, of people in the world of work. We need guidance also for judges, labor inspectors, and journalists. Journalists has a key role, and we know that at times how episodes of violence and harassment, particular discrimination-based violence and harassment, are portrayed in the media is very biased. So the recommendation calls for developing materials and raise awareness of journalists and media personnel to make their parts towards changing this mindset. And the last, but not least, is the recognition that this convention has on the effect on domestic violence and the world of work. I know that some of the sponsor and the key actors of this wonderful, organizer of this week is an organization dealing with family violence. We all know that a victim of domestic violence, let me put it this way, we all know that domestic violence is not something that stays within the house, within the domestic walls. It's not, it's a private issue, but it has consequences, and it's not actually a private issue. Apologies. This convention recognized that domestic violence has consequence on the world of work in terms of dignity, respect of the dignity of the workers, also in terms of productivity for employers, in terms of society, okay? So for the first time, this convention recognized that member states needs to recognize the fact that domestic violence is not a private issue, and so far as is reasonable, practical, mitigate its impact. How? The recommendation provides a few examples of measures that can be taken to mitigate the effect of domestic violence in the world of work. Provide leave for victims, for example, or flexible working arrangement, because this is a way also for the perpetrator not to know when the victim is at work. Temporary protection against dismissal, because people victims of domestic violence cannot be 100% productive, so they need protection against dismissal in that, during that terrible time. Again, including domestic violence in workplace risk assessment, and this is the role of OSH, of OSH management. Not only discrimination, but also domestic violence is an hazard and risk that needs to be taken into account. And of course, awareness raising. So this is really another game changer. And during COVID, we know that many governments, but also single employers or collective agreements included provision to mitigate the impact of domestic violence. This is a list of resources that I have. I will share it. Amber has my presentation, so I'm sure she would share it with you. We have several resources might be helpful. We have, for example, a practical guide for employers, which include also a sample of a workplace policy on violence and harassment. We have a policy brief on mental health at work, which includes specific reference on the effect of violence and harassment. We have a legal guide that explains the convention and also provide examples of how governments, but also workers and employers are crafting their legislation and regulation to be in line with the convention. And of course, a campaign, a lot of materials, and yeah, please feel free to have a look at all the references and reach out if in case of help or any clarification. So I'm over to you, Amber. I know I talked too much, but yeah, I hope it was clear.
No, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your presentation with us today. I do already have a question in the chat for you. So this came on in fairly early on in your presentation, wondering whether transgender people's rights are included in the definition of gender-based harassment and violence.
The definition of gender-based violence and harassment include a reference to both sex and gender. And if you read the definition, talk about persons. So it's the first time that an international treaty, talk about persons. So opening up, it's not only women that are victims of gender-based violence and harassment, but indeed there was an opening and it talk about sex or gender. So it's really, so there's a seed there, it's included. Of course, there is not a specific mentioning of but this was also a choice that came out of a thorough discussion to avoid having list of groups, because having list at times can also be, we leave out some groups, so we might not be inclusive. So the definition of gender-based violence is broad. it mentioned persons and sex or gender. And for the committee of experts, gender, while sex is biological, gender goes beyond, and also cultural and social forces, and also include sexual orientation and gender identity as it happening in other human rights mechanism.
Great, thank you. We have about 4 minutes left before our built-in 5-minute pause before our next presentation. So again, if anybody has questions for Valentina Beeghini and the presentation that she just shared with us, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A function, and I will pass them along. In the meantime, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a bit about how employers in New Brunswick can find out more about their obligations under international treaties like ILO Convention number 190.
Yes, yeah. In the last slide, there was a list of references. So they will find plenty of information. For employers, I would strongly suggest this practical guide that we developed for employers. That was really done by our bureau dealing with employers organizations, that was done in consultation with employers organization, and it's the target, the suggestion are really made for employers on how to help them implement this principle. We also have some guidelines on how to make measures against violence and harassment accessible for people with disabilities, for example, that can also be useful. We also have in the legal guide example of how other employers around the world have put in place measures. So we have from I don't know, red help button for the hotels in the US, from minivan in South Africa to drive workers working in remote areas. So let's say that the creativity and the range of measures that can be put in place is huge, and depends on national circumstances, sectoral circumstances, and all the references that I've listed have examples for the useful for the employers.
Wonderful, thank you. If there aren't any more questions from the audience, is there anything else you'd like to share with us, Valentina, about your presentation or any thoughts that have come up in the meantime?
No, just to say that, as I said before, Canada ratified this year, and Canada will have to report to the ILO Committee of Experts, which is this supervisory mechanism, in 2025. It's the first report, and it will have to report on how all level of governments in Canada are implementing this convention. So I know that a lot of consultation were undertaken in the process leading up to the ratification of Canada, because Canada required the consent and the approval and agreement of all provinces. And I'm sure that they will come back to you, to all provinces, to know how you are implementing this convention. So in case you have good practices, new regulation, I hear about new regulation in 2019, there would be a reporting, and it's good to show also what also each provinces have done, including also employers organization, workers organization, or other programs in each province.
Thank you so much for that information. Maybe we'll have to keep an eye out for what kind of information gets published or released in the next little while. Thank you so much for your presentation. I know that you're very busy and that you've got things you've got to get to today. So thank you so much for taking some time to share this information with us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. And yeah, best of luck for the continuation. And I might connect to other session.
Certainly, yes.
Yeah.
We're going to take a 5-minute pause.